So why this magazine now? Headlines across the country read, "The decline of the liberal arts and humanities," "Liberal arts education is dying," "Are the liberal arts dead?" Pew released a study in May 2024 asking, is college worth it? And only 25% of Americans say it is worth it to have a college degree. Gallup says confidence on higher education is down 48% since 2018 and 57% since 2015. That's a really sharp decline in less than a decade. And these headlines and polls are really not to be taken lightly. We seem to be at an inflection point in higher education. So the idea for this issue took hold. So let's imagine for a moment, you may want to close your eyes, what higher education could look like in 2040 something. Drawing upon a Knowledge Core algorithm, robots could teach client students, while generative AI might provide instant personalized feedback. Or the few celebrity faculty remaining might lecture as 3D holograms in students' own homes. Classes could have 25, 35, 50,000 students who never actually meet each other in person once. Let's not even think about student evaluations at that point, right? The university could entirely detach from space and place, and campuses with their housing, food costs, extracurricular activities and clubs, orientations, athletics, retreats, libraries, and heating and landscaping costs could shrink or simply disappear. Client students who know exactly what they want to do for the rest of their lives at the tender age of 17 could learn the exact skills they need to do the perfect future job at the least possible cost, and then the transaction would be complete. It's really hard for us to imagine what the rite of graduation passage might look like at that point. And the only reflection students might encounter then would be their own, caught in the screens of their iPhone 24, 25s. To some, this is a dream scenario, but reading through our issue of C21 magazine, I think you'll find that within the 500-year-old Jesuit Catholic tradition of companionship, this scenario would be a nightmare, since letting our students know us and us know them is a critical piece of the educational transformational education. And I dare say many of us in our varied roles across campus not only bring our whole selves to the classrooms, but we bring love in our daily work in the higher educational environment. When we ask that invaluable question, who will our students become? Listening to alumni, the community that we create together is one of meaning and purpose that endures in a network well beyond the college years. So I'd like to start the conversation today by thanking our MCAS Dean, Father Greg Kalscheur, our Provost, David Quigley, and our Associate Professor for Old Testament and BC grad in the Clough School of Theology and Ministry, Jaime Waters, for having this conversation at the launch today. Thank you. So David, could you tell us a little bit about what exactly the landscape for Jesuit Catholic education is, both domestically but also internationally, on some of these topics?
Sure, thanks so much. Let me thank Karen, return her kind words for all the great work that the center does, and especially you, Elizabeth, for pulling together this issue. When you look at the issue, it's a reminder of how blessed we are with the contributors, and even more when we look around the room here. I mean, it's really a conversation among collaborators, all of us leaning into the shared work of making the case for a particular vision of the liberal arts. It's a great snapshot of who we are as a university at this moment in time. And the first point that I would make, and this it can extend in many cases to other Jesuit and Catholic institutions of higher learning, though not all, is there's a certain countercultural force to it. I mean, your description of that dystopian future, the only thing scarier than the moment of graduation is imagining the society 10 years out when these kind of highly skilled technocrats have no ability to confront the grand vexing challenges, whatever the grand challenges of the later 20th onto the 21st onto the 22nd century will be. I think that, I mean, as I look at the assorted 24 presidents of the university, you think of Father McElroy, Father Gasson, the way in which they're working against the grain in certain ways as BC is launched. You go back to St. Ignatius and the other 16th century founding voices in Jesuit education. Go back to Bologna. Go back to the monasteries of the early Middle Ages, kind of preserving knowledge, preserving civilization. You go back to the first Christians. There's this kind of countercultural impulse, which I think is important to attach to the liberal arts. So that's a bit of a framing, at least in my mind, as we think about these remarks. I'll get to the question in just a moment, but the other piece that I would say is, I think, important, and I think all, at least American liberal arts institutions, and especially Jesuit Catholic institutions, grapple with. I think about our good friends out in Worcester, and Greg is on the board out at Holy Cross. But liberal arts, I don't know if I ever encountered the term liberal arts until I was around 16, 17-year-old and starting to look at colleges. I kind of knew implicitly what eventually I'd learn them to be, but they had never been presented to me as such. And if anything, back then, my first encounter, and I'm one of the folks who decided to go to a small liberal arts college, I was drawn to it, but I think just introspectively that there's a certain status attachment or prestige that has always been attached, not just in the U.S. higher ed context, but in other settings of the world. Liberal arts is something for some, not for others. An exclusionary piece to it, not necessarily an invitation to all. And I think as I've grown older, come to greater maturity and wisdom, I hope, and especially worked in this particular liberal arts context, that kind of liberationist, liberatory element within the liberal arts has become ever more pronounced for me, linked to, I think, a really important insight, which is that the liberal arts, when done right, leads to a kind of intellectual humility, which I think is critical on the road to a kind of wisdom. So in some ways, in tension with that kind of status hierarchy that liberal arts sometimes can play into. So again, one of the reasons that I'm interested in the question you just raised is that internationally, whenever I talk about our core or our commitments as a liberal arts university, when you talk to the 120 plus higher education institutions around the rest of the world beyond the US, very few of them have anything recognizably like an American core. They certainly trace back to the ratio and the 16th century origins of Jesuit higher education, but they play into the approaches that in so many other countries follow what you just described. You take your qualifying exams, your A-levels, whatever they are, at the end of your secondary school experience, and you're on a professional track, and there might be a little bit of formative education sprinkled in for undergraduates, but to the extent those institutions have a recognizably liberal arts ethos, it's very often in faculties of theology or philosophy or in other areas. So that kind of global comparative context, I think, is important for us and says that there's something a little bit unique. Don't want to go fully American exceptionalist here, but there's something a little bit different at play here. But then also within the 27 Jesuit colleges and universities, and here I'll put a plug in for Father Leahy, his book, Adapting to America, which is a study of the late 19th century and 20th century emergence of Jesuit colleges and universities, coming into their recognition as American institutions, so part of the American system, but also in some ways, as I said, distinctive, if not fully countercultural. And I think across that network, we live out our mission. We inherit that tradition in a range of particular ways, but in so many, and I'll be spending time, I guess, in Creighton next month with the Jesuit Provost. It's interesting how the liberal arts are a point of continuing contention, but a recognition among those schools in a very strong place like BC and others that are facing greater challenges right now. There's a recognition that leaning into that liberal arts tradition and those liberatory possibilities of liberal arts education done right is in so many ways a competitive advantage.
David, you mentioned formation, and I hope Greg will talk to this point. Greg, BC's commitment to formative education, articulated both in the undergraduate and the graduate level, may be an area of uniqueness, as David was just pointing out. What are a few examples of the ways that we hope that our undergraduates and graduates experience formation, take away from their BC experience beyond just the intellectual rigor of their coursework.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and let me join David and Jaime in thanking Karen for drawing us all together, and thanks to all of you for coming. I want to pick up on a strand of what David was talking about in terms of the liberal arts and freedom and connect that to formation. You know, I think we don't probably often enough make that connection that a liberal arts education is an education for freedom, to be authentically free, to be an authentically free human being. And I think our formative efforts are in part grounded in that kind of idea. So I think you adverted to Father Kovenbach's question about who our students become. So often when I'm talking with parents or students about what we're trying to do here, I'll reference that talk from 20 plus years ago at Santa Clara, where Father Kovenbach said the measure of our schools is who our students become. What kind of person do they become through their experience of a formative liberal arts education at Boston College? And I think part of what we hope for is that they become authentically free. And you know, that doesn't mean free to do whatever they want. It's not freedom as license. Instead, it's responsible freedom. It's freedom that's grounded in human dignity and that is working for the common good. And I think it's also important from a Jesuit perspective to recognize that that formation for freedom is, in a sense, grounded in the spiritual exercises. The spiritual exercises are about how do we help people become freer to hear God's will and respond to it? How do we help people to be freer to choose the greater good? How do we help people to be freer to discern well? And so I think our formative efforts at the undergraduate level or at the graduate level are pointed towards that formation of a certain kind of person, to be authentically free, to be a fully flourishing human being, ready to exercise responsible freedom, ready to take responsibility for contributing to the common good. You know, I think from a kind of academic program perspective, at the undergraduate level, we've spent a lot of time over the last decade, led by David and Mary Crane and Andy Boynton and others, to really think about how do we do this more authentically in the core curriculum. So how are we thinking about integrating character formation and intellectual rigor, and especially, I think, reflection and discernment in the way in which we teach core courses. So we could talk a lot more about that, but I think the kind of reflective, formative intentionality, the importance of pedagogy, and maybe you'll talk about faculty a bit later, but I think the pedagogical intent that we bring to this is particularly formative. And how are we helping students to make connections among things? How are we helping students to ask good questions about what they're learning? Not just what is all this information, but what does it mean and why is it important and how does it change me? There's all kinds of formative programs that are co-curricular that are helpful too. I think something like the halftime retreat is something that I've been involved in different ways, which I think is really critically important from the Center for Student Formation. Again, introducing students in a way to formation. What brings me joy? What am I good at? What does the world need? Or a set of reflective questions that connect to what they've done in their classes, hopefully, in a kind of integrative way. The graduate level, formation at the graduate level, I think, is a harder thing to get our minds around and to implement, and I think we need to do more. I think the current strategic plan at the university has called us to think more seriously about formation in the entire university community, and we've focused a lot of good attention on the undergraduates. How to translate some of that into graduate programs is more challenging. In my own experience, before coming over to the Morrissey College as a law school faculty member, I think I spent a lot of time in sort of the law school cognate of halftime, which was called Sidebar, but another kind of effort to get students to think about what are they doing. And often in a way that's different from our undergraduates, law students coming from a range of different undergraduate experiences haven't thought about some of those questions. And so I think it's critically important in that kind of setting. I also found as a law school faculty member, I was conscious of my teaching in a formative way. especially in a course like civil procedure, for example. And how are we helping students learn to navigate the system in a way that's conscious of who they are as a lawyer and how that's impacting people? I think more broadly, we have to think about how to bring those questions of formation and discernment into other graduate programs. And one of the challenges, I think, is that graduate programs are different. You know, they're even within the Morrissey College, the different graduate programs across the range of departments have different kinds of focuses. I think in recent years, there's been some effort to do halftime sidebar type things in philosophy and theology, which has been successful. Maybe more broadly, and I think this is hard, and I'm not sure how we begin to go down this path, but part of what formation for graduate students has to be, I think, is introducing them to a wider intellectual landscape. You know, they come from an undergraduate background, they choose to specialize in a doctoral program. The focus is, in a way, about getting very expert in a narrow question, but part of what doing that at BC ought to be is, I think, trying to connect that narrow expertise with a wider intellectual landscape, and how do we do that well across programs? I think we've got a lot of work to do there. We have to ask ourselves what's different about having done a PhD or a master's degree at Boston College, and I think some of that has to be connection to this wider integrative vision that might not always be present in a graduate program at other places. But I don't think we've done enough on that front yet.
So one of the questions we're often asked is, why does the Corps have such a large footprint? Why are there so many core classes? Jaime, could you tell us, you're a professor of the Old Testament. Was that what you wanted to be when you were 17 years old thinking about coming to Boston College?
No, thank you. No. and my family certainly didn't expect this at all. No, when I started at BC, I was a political science major. I thought I might go to law school. I don't know what I was going to do after that, but that's kind of what I had come up with. And in my first semester at BC, I took perspectives on Western culture with Carrie Cronin. And in addition to a political science class and some other core classes that just were of interest, and I found myself really drawn to theology and philosophy and not really as excited by political science as I had hoped. And I wrestled with that, but I just sort of leaned into it and said, okay, this is part of being in college. And so I said, just not give up on political science yet, but let's just see how this plays out. And then in my second semester, I'm like, I'm really kind of struggling with these courses, and I just love my theology homework. And again, not what I expected to be saying when I came to BC. I remember sharing this with my mom in particular, who was very excited, and I guess I'll say also, since we're here gathered for this C21 Resources magazine, she received hers in the mail, so for the mailings, it is getting to alums and parents. And so anyway, she loves BC. She loves to hear all about what's happening here. But I remember saying, I'm taking all these classes, and, I really don't think I want to do political science. And she said, that's great. That's what college is for. It's a time to explore and to think about where you see yourself. I'm like, yeah, I think I want to study theology, maybe double major with philosophy. And I was sharing this with my mom recently, and I'm like, do you remember what you said to me when I came home after Christmas? And she's like, oh yeah, I said, that's great. And I'm like, no, that's not quite how that conversation went. I said, I really want to study theology, and you said, what about business? That was her first reaction. And I said, no, I certainly don't want to study business. And then I shared what I was learning in my classes, in perspectives. I shared, actually, kind of to echo what Greg mentioned, that I was learning questions I didn't even know I should be asking. I learned that I just wasn't even thinking in ways that I could and should be. And so I was so excited by that. And so And I said, don't worry, I'll get a job. So I get the parental concern over this. I know my mom well, and so I knew I better have some, like, what am I going to do with theology information to share with her. But I said, I really just love this intellectual pursuit. I love being able to think in new ways, think critically, and I can find something to do with it, don't worry. And so I think that she didn't continue to push business, although that was the initial reaction, but I think there was a real appreciation for the ways that the Corps in particular was opening me up and helping me to think in ways that I just hadn't before I came here.
Greg and David will just weigh in, but in talking to you, the role of the faculty seemed really critical. Faculty are still with us today, actually.
Yeah, I should say, when I mentioned Carrie Cronin, I say I can thank Carrie Cronin or blame Carrie Cronin. I'm gonna go with thank, of course, but yes, in particular, the Perspectives course, because it was a year-long course, so we spent, well, a year together, not with our faculty, but also as a cohort in our course. And so not only did it help me to connect with my fellow classmates, but Carrie in particular showed a lot of interest and just was available both in and outside of the classroom to really to support me and to encourage me to think about what this kind of career might look like. And so, yeah, I mean, if I hadn't taken Perspectives, I mean, sometimes I just wonder what I've studied, but it was really the Perspectives course that made me change my major.
So many directions I could go with on that. I would say, I think first thought that comes to mind is Father Jack Butler has very often over the last decade plus as vice president for mission and ministry talked about faculty as the primary formators, making the classroom the space that is the kind of seedbed, the grounds, like that long ago Perspectives class for the most meaningful formation. And in my own decade and a half of hearing that phrase, I've gone from an easy kind of sense of, wow, that's flattering, that kind of elevates the faculty. We all as faculty in the room love it when we are held up at the center of the university, to a growing sense of responsibility, the kind of obligation we have to rise to the level. If we are the primary formators, we can't just do what we would do in a classroom unthinkingly 20 years ago or at any other great American university. What is it that we're doing to reach the young 17, 18-year-olds who've never encountered theology or urban history or legal studies before, to bring them into a rich conversation about the discipline, but also open up their horizons in powerful ways?
I think that's a really important point. So a liberal arts education or a formative humanistic education doesn't just happen because you have the right set of disciplines in your curriculum. I think that's a really important point to recognize. You can't just say, take this and this and this, and it all adds up to a liberal arts education that does what you hope for. It really depends on how those courses are taught. So I think in the end, pedagogy is really important. Is there a humanistic, liberating, reflective, discerning pedagogy brought to bear, no matter what's being taught? And I think that's a really important thing that has been clear to me, both as somebody who began teaching at the higher education level in a law school setting, not teaching what would be thought of as a liberal arts discipline, but I think trying to teach it in a way that was inspired by a liberal arts intentionality. But then kind of diving into some of the work that John O'Malley has done in the history of Jesuit education. So John O'Malley's a Jesuit historian who passed away fairly recently. And in a series of talks and papers, he made a similar point about it not being so much what you're teaching, but how you're teaching it. And any discipline really can be liberating or can have a humanistic dimension to it if it's taught in the right way. Am I asking questions that are connecting the content to the students' lives? Am I asking questions that help the students try to see how this discipline might connect with that discipline, or how it helps them to think about what they're going to do in the world? That's all dependent on how the course is taught. And he contrasted sort of that kind of pedagogy with what might be more typical in graduate school, where there's a kind of professionally oriented expertise around the discipline that is the primary thing. And I think in an undergraduate liberal arts education, we want there to be intellectual rigor, and we want to approach things with that kind of rigor. But we have to think about what the intentionality is, and it's different than that kind of professionalization. It's really got to be rigor integrated with character formation and thinking about this question of who are students becoming. And that, in the end, I think is a matter of what kind of questions do we ask. I don't think there's a mystery about what formative education really is. It's, am I thinking about questions that help a student develop as a person? Am I helping them think about who they are, who they want to be, how they'll get there? So maybe I'll just close by saying I think who the faculty members are and how they understand their role is really essential to the success or failure of something distinctive about a formative Jesuit Catholic liberal arts education really is. So that's the point I think that Jack Butler's making when he says the faculty members are the primary formators. Students come to a university for the academic program. There's all kinds of formative things that are going on in all kinds of great ways across the university. But they're coming here, I'd say fundamentally, for the teaching and learning. So the faculty members have to be the primary vehicles of what's distinctive here. They have to be the primary providers of what's distinctive here. And they have to understand that. And I think faculty members don't often come with that understanding. Their own undergraduate education might have been quite different. Their own graduate professional education might have been quite different. So I've tended to see my own role as dean in an important way as trying to convey that part of what we're doing and hiring and preparing and forming and promoting faculty members is really thinking about, do they understand their role in this kind of education? How are we helping them to become really good teachers in this formative way, contributing to this liberal arts project? Because if they're not doing it, it's not going to happen just because I take a history class or just because I take an English class. It has to be, how is it taught most fundamentally?
David, I want to ask you, so it's almost a year now we've been wrestling with how do you assess the impact and value of a liberal arts education. We've tried to apply an economic lens, a sociological lens, a historical lens, right? We've looked at it a lot of ways, but how might you provide some guidance to us? And one of the programs that you've brought to campus is the Boston College Prison Education Program, and I think that really complicates, in some ways, what we think a liberal arts education is for. So maybe you can talk to that.
We could go on all day about what we're doing out at MCI Shirley, where the first graduates will receive their BC bachelors on the 23rd. And Dean Goodman will be there recognizing those Woods College graduates. One of the interesting encounters, and it's a similar experience to what we've had on campus. When I arrived in the late 90s, and especially as I moved into the dean's role in 2008, into Greg's current office, there was a little bit of a zero-sum, more than a little bit. There was a considerable zero-sum thinking about it's either liberal arts or it smacks of professional preparation. And over the last decade and a half, and I begrudgingly will give so much credit to Andy Boynton, the dean of the Carroll School, on this, we've reached a point where very few, I'd say just about no one else in higher ed is able to kind of think about moving back and forth. So as we've thought about pathways for undergraduates, for partnerships between faculty, for drawing on resources with Carroll, Cannell, Lynch at the undergraduate level, Woods as well, now Messina with Morrissey, there's been a kind of rich back and forth, and it's been interesting. Both our anonymous funders for the prison education program and the Bard Prison Initiative out of New York that's been a great partner on the work, there was an impulse on both of their parts to go in and teach these men a pure liberal arts approach where it would just be history, philosophy, theology, the good stuff. What's been interesting there is the men on the ground at MCI Shirley in some ways had the insight that we've found here on campus that they're thirsty for that stuff, that the theology is in many ways the highlights for many of their experiences there. There's a Thomas Merton Society chapter at MCI Shirley of all places. Yet they have constantly looking, is there an entrepreneurship kind of experience? The Harrington family, John and his son Brian, have opened up wonderful opportunities with Boston area businessmen coming in, that they know the liberal arts are critical, but the liberal arts connected to the ways in which they might imagine making an impact in their communities for their families. And so for me, it's been eye-opening to think about how you can move back and forth between different experiments, different settings, and draw learnings that can enrich what we're doing with 9,000 day students on campus. thinking of the great assessment question, which is one of those which we're never going to quite come to the answer to, but continuing to put it before us is essential. And I thank you, Celeste Wells, others who've done such great work with the core and thinking through meaningful and authentic forms of assessment. I go back to one of the earlier conversations like this as part of the university sesquicentennial back in 2013. We had a distinguished set of speakers, college presidents from around the country, leading scholars talking about basically answering your questions. And the one that stayed with me was Andrew Del Banco, a great literary scholar at Columbia who's written widely in the New York Review and with his books on higher ed, its history, its current state, its prospect. And there he gave the answer, which I'd heard him give at different settings previously, but he drove it home as part of our sesquicentennial. And it's too cute, but it's a core truth. It's only at the 20th or 25th reunion when you talk to alumni and talk about the lives they've lived, who they've become, the worlds that they've engaged and we've hoped impacted for the better, the faculty members that they become at a formative institution. It is only at that 15, 20, 25-year horizon where one can fully assess what formative education has meant. Again, it's too cute in some ways. The parents who are going around campuses with their 17-year-olds are not looking for what that 25th reunion wisdom conversation will look like. But I do think one of the best projects that I engaged in back when I was dean and that we're working through another set of iterations are young alumni surveys, kind of BC alumni 3, 5, 10 years out. Some of the most telling data that in some ways helped fuel the renewal of the core, that has shaped my own thinking of where to direct resources or where to place points of emphasis, came out of those voices. Because I think it is really in the fourth year that the experiences that Biz and Greg, Akua, others will be leading going forward, that we're beginning to see students making sense of the full impact and where we can begin to assess, and then carrying that forward a few years out. I think there's real insight to be gained there.
So Jaime, what's it like to be back now that you are on the faculty of the Clough School of Theology and Ministry and with a different student population?
Sure. I mean, it's amazing to be back. When I think back to myself at BC, I knew I wanted to be a professor. The idea that I could somehow be back here to do it, I don't think, I couldn't even say it was a goal. It just seemed like an impossibility. So, I mean, it really is, I'm really fortunate and blessed just to be back here. So I love it. I mean, it's wonderful. I guess what's different now, aside that I'm a faculty member, but being at the Clough School, our students are primarily preparing for careers in ministry, and so they're graduate students. And so it's interesting both to be able to reach that population, which is a different group of students or different types of students than I initially started with teaching. I started teaching primarily undergrads. And it's pretty fantastic to be able to kind of merge their love and interest in studying theology with a real intention to seeing this as a part of their career, as a part of their vocation. And so all the things that I teach them, I try to have in mind, how will this be applicable in their ministerial context? So we are always sort of mindful of how this sort of plays out in the church and the world. And so not solely just giving them a set of facts to learn, but actually thinking about how they'll use this in the work that they hope to do. This sort of builds a bit on Greg's point just about graduate students, because as you were talking especially about formation for graduate students, I think in this instance, the Clough School may not be just the only exception, but is a really great model. And obviously I'm biased since I'm a professor there, but graduate student formation is central, and it makes sense for the type of work we're doing that would be so central. But we have students preparing for ordained and lay ministry, and so not only do we have programming, but we have staff who are dedicated to our graduate students' spiritual formation and development. And so it is really an intentional piece of the school that not only it comes through in our classes, but it's there right alongside in sort of all the programming that the Clough School offers. So it could be something useful, or at least a model or something for other graduate programs here to consider, to think of ways that to be intentional about creating opportunities and moments for sort of formation at the graduate level.
So appreciative for this conversation, Jaime and Father Greg and David and, of course, Elizabeth. Thank you again, and have a great rest of the week. Take care.